So let's jump in. Rob, I know that I've known you for quite some time. And I will tell you what you probably don't realize this, and the viewing audience certainly doesn't, but it was many years ago. I remember a voicemail message that came down through an old program that we were associated with, and it talked about this guy named Rob Terrell, who I didn't know, and what had happened to him and his family, and I didn't know them either. And I was a part of being someone who did pray for you guys, you know, and I was able to pray for you. I was able to have a little bit of a connection there. And I know that there was thousands of people that were influenced over what you're going to share with us here in a few minutes. And as time went on and God did what he did, I was able to have a relationship with you one-on-one, like a personal, I've been at your home and I've been able to drive in a car with you. I mean, a lot of different things. And I've learned a lot more about you and all that you have to offer. And the truth is, here we are today on this podcast, and I am absolutely thrilled that not only are you taking the time to do this, but that I have the opportunity to be the one asking the questions. So Rob, I don't want to go back as far as when you were born, because I think that, this could be a long call, but I obviously the very best place to start is going to be really where this story begins, because so much of your life today and what you're doing today comes from that day. And so tell us, if you don't mind, share with us your story and take as much time as you'd like, because that's why I'm here.
Terrific. Well, as you know, we were building a business that kind of expanded across the country, and a networking style business. And we were deep into that and working hard at it. And I was living in the Phoenix Valley area, Gilbert, Arizona at the time. And, but my parents lived about 170 miles northeast of us up in Show Low, up in the mountains in Arizona. And so I would go up there a lot, and I grew up there and hunted and did all the stuff up there. And so I was up there, and my horse trailer needed some work on it. And so anyway, we were up there, and my dad and I were working on the horse trailer. And I had a meeting in a location where we had a bunch of people who were expecting me to show up. And that meeting was in a location that you just couldn't get to easily. As the crow flies, it was 35 minutes away, but to drive, it was either way you went was probably 4 hours. And so I was going to get cut short. I told my dad, hey, I'm going to have to cut short here, because I got a long drive to get to my meeting tonight. He said, well, no, don't worry about it. He said, we'll just fly. I'll fly you down there. And my dad owned a Beach Baron. He was a very experienced pilot and certified flight instructor. And I said, wow, that'd be great. And so I made arrangements to get picked up at the airport and the whole deal. And so about 7:00 that evening, the meeting was going to start at 8. About 7:00, we jumped in the airplane in Show Low and fired it up and headed for a little town called Morenci, in the kind of on the eastern border of the state of Arizona, up in the mountains. So we headed that way. And Morenci's a mining town, so it actually has a significant airport, because Phelps Dodge would fly their private jets in there. So significant airport, we didn't really have any concern. And so we took off. And of course, it was a dark night. It was November. There's no moon. And I remember as we took off from Show Low, you could see the lights on the ground. I can just remember thinking about how the lights on the ground kind of ended up looking like stars the further you got away from them. But we headed over the mountain where the mine is, and we could see the lights on in the mine, but we couldn't get the lights on at the airport. We tried in airports like that, small airports, they run on what they call a Unicom system. So it's a radio powered system. So when you get to the location, you put in a certain frequency in your radio, you click your mic, see 5 or maybe 8 times, it turns on the lights. Well, we did that, and we couldn't get the lights on. And so we circled, and we kind of knew where the airport was. It was dark. We couldn't really see it, but we kind of knew where it was. So we were circling around it, trying to figure out how to get the lights on. And And I know, it's dangerous to land in the dark. And so I thought my phone was in the seat behind me. So I was going to have to climb over the seat to get my phone to call the guys on the ground. But so I told Dad we were about I don't know, the fifth circle around, trying to get oriented, trying to figure this out. And I told my dad, who was flying the airplane, I said, look, I'm going to climb over the seat, get my phone and call him and tell him we're going to go to Safford, which is about maybe a 30-minute drive from there. We're going to go to Safford, go ahead and start the meeting. Someone come and get me in Safford. We'll just wrap up the meeting. So that's kind of what we were planning to do. And that's when I said that to my dad, I said, I'm going to climb in the back, get the phone. He said, I got it. And I had a lot of confidence in my dad as a pilot. Very skilled pilot. And so when he said, I got it, I'm like, okay, let's do it. So we circled that sixth time and we were downwind, and he had the runway, he had it all. But because of the airplane altimeters work on barometric pressure. And so when the barometric pressure changes, it'll change your altimeter, maybe not to be exactly accurate. And so it turns out our altimeter was 130 feet off. So we were actually 130 feet lower than what our altimeter said. And we knew, of course, the elevation of the airport, we knew all that, but he came around downwind and we turned into the base for that landing and turned into final. And as we turned into final coming in, of course, we couldn't see anything. The closer you got to the ground, the less you could see, and so we started to come in on that. And that runway is up on a plateau. So there's kind of a ravine there, and the road went up through the ravine and around to the airport. And so we're coming in there, and we came in too low. We were just too low. So we were actually flying into the ravine, and we were below the surface of the runway and Dad figured it out. And it was, to give you the experience, it was like hanging in the darkness when we, because we're just flying, but it's like we're hanging there trying to figure out, okay, what's next, and then react to it. Well, Dad figured it out that we were too low, and he reached up and put the power in on that airplane. It's a very responsive airplane. It's a small twin. They're kind of like the sports car of twins. And that airplane responded. He pulled the nose up, and we went and we started taking back off up. And we actually missed the wall of the ravine. I wouldn't be talking to you today if we'd hit the ravine, but we actually went right out over the top edge of the ravine. But 6 feet in from the tip of the left wing, we caught a power pole. And interestingly enough, we didn't damage the wires. That the wing just took the center section of the pole completely out, but it did rip the left wing off that airplane. We probably hit it at 120 miles an hour, just my guess. And of course, the fuel in those airplanes the fuel tanks are in the wings. So we immediately blew apart a fuel tank. Gas went everywhere. We burst into flames. And fortunately, about 200-300 yards later, we landed upright with the one wing in the airplane. We landed upright, and which is another reason why I'm here, because the way you get out of that airplane, it's a low wing airplane, so you had to get out on the wing. The right wing was still there, and that's where we got out. Dad was in the left seat. I was in the right seat. I honestly, to this day, I don't remember how we got out. I have my suspicions of how we got out, but my belief is that I popped myself loose, opened the door. Of course, I opened it into fire because that right engine was burning. The gas everywhere was burning. So I opened into that, and then I believe I jumped up on the wing and pulled my dad out to me. The reason I believe that is because I was burned over 40%. So all the right side of my ear was burned off. All this side of my head was burned. My back, my shoulder, this right shoulder was burned unmercifully. And I was burned all the way down to my belt. I was burned on both legs. But my back was burned real bad. So I believe I jumped on the wing and turned my back and shoulder into the fire and grabbed Dad and pulled him out. The reason I believe that's how it happened is because Dad was only burned about 20%, and mostly his hands and his head. So I think my body shielded him. And we both climbed off the wing of the airplane and walked away from the airplane. And so we we got a little bit of ways. And I remember, one of the things I do remember is I remember looking back at the airplane. And in a dark night, you'd expect it to be an orange glow, but it wasn't. It was a white glow. I mean, it was as white could be. And, what's interesting is I saw people around the airplane that just kind of went away. And it was just strange to me. But I remember thinking at that point, because Dad, are you okay? Yeah, I'm good. And so I said, okay, I'm going for help. So I turned in the direction that I thought where help was. I kind of turned in the direction where I thought the airport was. We were probably 1,000 feet short of the runway at that point. So I started walking towards in that direction. And I remember getting out a little bit thinking, oh, I hope Dad's okay. I turned around and looked, and I watched him collapse on the ground. And at that point, I was dressed for a meeting. So I had my white shirt on. I didn't have my tie on. I was going to put it on for the meeting. And then I had a windbreaker type of a jacket over me. It was a November night. It was cool, cold night here in Arizona mountains. And I just remember as I walked out of the light of the airplane, of the burning, I remember thinking, oh, I think my jacket, my jacket, I think it's melted in the fire. And I think it melted to the backs of my hands. Because as I was walking away from the airplane, I looked down and there's this stuff hanging off my fingers, at the end of my fingers. And so I just assumed that was the jacket that had kind of melted on my hand and was burned off. And of course, later I realized that was my skin. The jacket was gone, and that was my skin that was hanging off my hands. And the guys that were there at the airport to pick us up, they came over, they parked a truck out into the desert a little bit towards the airplane, about, 150 yards from the airplane. Now, remember, my dad's laying down back there, but they got me and they set me up on the tailgate of the truck. And then my friends, the people that were there to pick me up, they were running back and forth, and of course they'd come to me and I'd say, how's Dad? He's doing good. Don't worry about your dad. And, and he'd tell the same. And of course they called 911, they called emergency vehicles, but we were a long way away from any help. And so they turned out, I think they turned out ambulances out of the mine. The mine had a small hospital clinic, to take care of injuries or, sickness or whatever with the mine workers there. So they took us to that location. Of course, they did not have any of the medical preparation for where we were at. And so Life for Light was called in immediately. And they brought in 2 helicopters for us. And so the first helicopter, Dad was going to be put on first. And I've been told this story, and I think it's probably somewhere out in a newsreel somewhere. I probably could find it. I've not really had a lot of motivation to find it, but they said when they were loading Dad on the helicopter, they started giving him CPR. He arrested right there, and then Dad passed in flight. The second helicopter came in. They picked me up, and when they took off, they were going to take me to the Arizona Burn Center, which would have been about probably a 45, 50-minute flight. And with the condition that I was in, they turned the bird to Tucson Medical Center, which was a 15-minute flight, and it's a trauma 1 level hospital. And so they turned me to Tucson. My family had been called. My wife, the first message they got was, they've crashed in the airplane, but there's bumps and bruises, but everyone's okay. And then the second call they got was, you need to go to the Arizona Burn Center. That's where they're bringing them, and it doesn't look good. They went to the Arizona Burn Center, and while they were there, the next call they got was, we're turning them to Tucson Medical Center. If you want to see your husband alive, you'll probably want to come to Tucson Medical Center. And so, and of course, Dad passed. And so they loaded up our Suburban, and my wife, my father-in-law, Pete Lewis at the time, and my mother was in the car, and then my 2 older kids. And my wife specifically said they were 14 and 11. And my wife specifically said, you two are going because this may be the last time you see your father. And so they loaded in the Suburban and they started to head for Tucson. Well, about halfway down, now my mom, she's sitting in the middle seat and she suffers from hypertension. My father-in-law is driving. My wife is in the shotgun seat, and then my two kids were in the back, or maybe one was in the middle. My daughter, I think, was in the third seat in the Suburban. And so as they're driving to Tucson, my wife gets the call. And the call is that, my dad has passed, and that I'm there, and that I'm there. It's critical. And of course, now dad's passed. My wife hands the phone to my mom. It was a friend on the other end of the phone. My dad was a dentist, and he had a close friend that worked out of Tucson Medical Center. He was an orthopedic surgeon. Well, he got called immediately, and he came down. He was at the hospital there when the two birds arrived. And so he called my mom. And so at least it was a friend calling to say that dad had passed. And of course, my wife now is freaked out because my mom suffers from hypertension. So she thought, we're maybe going to have another emergency here in the Suburban. So she climbed into the middle seat. Well, when she had taken the phone call, she turned to her dad, who was driving, and said, we lost Doc. We used to call my dad Doc. He was a dentist. So we've lost Doc. Well, my daughter, who's a teenager in the back seat, could read lips. And so she thought her mother told Pete, we lost him. And so Chelsea, in the back seat of the Suburban, started freaking out. I mean, emotionally freaking out. So Stephanie climbed into the middle seat to give the phone to my mom, and she turned to her daughter and said, Chelsea, your dad's still alive. And you need to hold it together. So Chelsea, at 14 years old, she decided to start praying. And she didn't decide to just pray. She decided to pray out loud. So she started praying in the Suburban on the drive down there. And she started with things like, come on, Dad, you can make this. Come on, Dad, you can do it. You need to hang in there. We need you, Dad. Those were all cry outs to God. So I tell people today that I was probably saved on the faith of a 14-year-old child. And so they got me there. They immediately put on fluids, because when you burn, the burns demand fluid out of your body. So you can dehydrate almost immediately, especially with the amount of burns that I had. So they put me on tons of IV, and they got me somewhat stable. My wife was able to come in and see me. My father-in-law will tell you the story that he didn't recognize me. He didn't know it was me. My wife tells me the only way I knew it was you was because from your knees down, I could see your feet and I knew your feet. But my head had swollen probably to the size of a basketball. And, I was pretty messed up. Of course, they cut most of all my clothes off. They had to cut my wedding ring off because of the swelling. But they got me stabilized there in Tucson. And then they rescheduled the Flight for Life to take me to the Arizona Burn Center. And of course, the family then got back in the Suburban and drove back. They said as they were fueling the Suburban in Tucson, they heard the Flight for Life helicopter take off and head back to the Phoenix area to the Arizona Burn Center. And interestingly enough, you live in a community, you guys in Columbus, and you don't even know there's a burn center in town, right? I mean, I never knew. It was at our county hospital. County hospital is not someplace you'd want to frequent, just because it was in a rough part of town, and they dealt with a lot of the people that are less fortunate than all of us, and they dealt with a lot of the prisoners from the prisons, and so county hospital just wasn't, you just didn't, and that's where the Arizona Burn Center is. And it turns out, I find out later, that the Arizona Burn Center is one of the top 5 burn centers in the world. And so I was in the right place. And of course, the family set up camp there. I was immediately treated. I weighed when I was working out at that time. I was in pretty good shape for I was 38 years old. I was in pretty good shape for an adult. I was 208 pounds. I lifted a lot, and so I was in tone and very good shape. And I took a lot of vitamins. I was just we were almost overzealous with vitamins. We took a lot of vitamins, and so, which I think is another thing, was a factor of saving my life. But when I checked into the Arizona Burn Center, they checked me in at 263 pounds. And so that was a representation of the fluid that they put on me to help save me. And it's kind of a gamble, because too much fluid, you could drown him in his own lungs. Not enough fluid, and he dehydrates because of the burn. The burns just demand the fluid away. And so anyway, they set up camp at the Arizona Burn Center, and we started the recovery. They immediately put me into a drug-induced coma. They paralyzed me. They put me on a breathing machine, and they kept me that way probably for 4 weeks. So that's kind of the story that got me to the burn center. I don't know how much more you want on that, but there we are.
Well, Rob, I've heard this story a couple times. I've read your story, and I'm tearing up listening to you share it again, especially about your 14-year-old daughter and her faith in prayer. And it's like, wow. This is many, many years ago, for you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's just very special. I mean,
Yeah.
she has to remember that more than probably anyone.
She does,
she
and
felt at that moment.
we've had those conversations about that. But it's kind of neat to think that maybe I was resting on the faith of a 14-year-old child, and that, to me, that just brings me alive to the Lord and to what He does and how He impacts us in our lives. Absolutely.
Well, before I ask a question about you, tell me what led your daughter to the point where she wanted to cry out to the Lord in a moment like that, as opposed to being angry or doing something else.
Right. And we as a family, strong Christian family, we were part of the church. I was serving on the board of an Assemblies of God church at that time. I taught Sunday school. My wife, we were very actively involved. So the kids were always around that. Plus, we also had them in private Christian school. So they were getting Bible teaching and faith-based teaching and that type. They were getting that, in more than one location, plus being at home. And one of the things which is interesting, kind of leads me into the story I'll tell you, but we would get up as a family and pray every morning. And it was just kind of a routine. And we probably did it 5 days a week. So before school, before anything, kids had to show up on the couch and pray. And we would pray together, and we'd talk about goals for the day. And, sometimes I would share something. Sometimes Mom would share something. We'd read something from the Bible that was on our heart, or we'd read a book or something like that. But we did that pretty consistently for quite a long time. So the kids were immersed in faith. And what's interesting, and it just kind of leads into the story, I'll tell you that after the crash and I was in a coma, that getting up at 7 and praying together kind of stopped. Mom was busy. She would come to the burn center every day. The kids were being taken care of by other family and friends. And it was, as you can only imagine, how chaotic it was. Well, so that all stopped. Well, about 3 weeks into this, my wife says, man, if there was ever a time we needed to pray, it's right now. And so she told the kids, tomorrow morning, we're going to start back on our prayer. So plan to be up. We're going to pray. Now, I was in the burn center in a coma. So she got the kids up, and they were all on the couch ready to go. She had nothing. Her heart was empty. She was completely on empty. So she went into our library and she grabbed a book. We had a large library. We had bought lots of different books, faith-based books, all kinds of books. But there was a book in there by a gentleman named Dr. Murdoch. He runs a ministry in Fort Worth, Texas. It's a place called the Wisdom Center. but he had written a book entitled The Covenant of the 58 Blessings. And so she pulled that book off of out of there and just started to read it. She said, there's ever a time we need some blessing, this is it. Well, to make it really short, the story talks about Dr. Murdoch being in an airport and his flight got canceled. So he started going through the Bible and he was looking for promises in the Bible. So he was flipping through trying to find the different promises that God makes in the Bible. And the Lord moved over him, and I probably won't tell this to his credit, but I will get it close. But the Lord came over him and said, I want you to make a covenant offering in my name. And I want, and so he had gone through and found 58 different blessings in the Bible, 58 different promises. Anyway, so he decided, okay, there's 58 blessings here. I'm going to give, and he was broke at the time. I mean, he didn't have any money at the time. So he wrote a check to his church right there in the airport that night for $58. He wrote another one for $58 for his son, and he claimed the promises and the covenant offering, that covenant offering was placed for his son as well. So she read this to our kids. Well, they got far enough into the book where they heard enough of that story. So that afternoon after school, the kids got together, broke all their penny banks open, got all their money together, and that afternoon, that evening, when she came home from the burn center, they brought it to Mom and they said, Mom, we want to give all of our money as a covenant offering to the church for God's promise to heal Dad. And she was thinking, well, you can't buy God blessings. But she said, this is such a faith-based move. We're going to do this. So she counted it up, and I think there was $51 amongst all the kids in their piggy bank. So she put the remaining $7 with it to make it the 58. And so they gave that offering to the church and explained it to the church as a covenant offering. And of course, in my book, you'll know there's the letter from my associate pastor that received that offering and how it impacted him. But anyway, the long story of that is, after I got out of the burn center, I was at home. We were maybe, 6 months into recovery. I was working, I was pushing harder than I probably should have to try to recover. I was fairly atrophied. I was pretty weak. And I was on still heavy medications, opioids, and just different things. But anyway, we had friends, business associates and close friends of ours, and they were there, and he had become kind of a father figure to me. He was a mentor and a business mentor and a father. And we were talking, and I was talking about working out and that, and he said to all of us, the four of us were sitting there, he said, Rob, you need to take it easy. You need to, he said, you were told you were going to be in the burn center for 6 months. And he said, and do you remember on the 57th day, you called and said you're going home? Well, when he said that, my wife stopped and she started to tear up and get emotional. And she got up and walked out of the room. And I was left with the two, and I'm like, I don't know what's wrong. They said, what's wrong? What did we say? And so, interestingly enough, she went out, she collected herself, she got that book, The Covenant of the 58 Blessings, and she brought it back. And she explained it to all of us, that what had happened with the kids. No one knew. I didn't know. The only people that knew were my wife, my kids, and my pastor. And so she had explained that and to what had happened and about their covenant offering that they made to the church. And on the 58th day, I came home. And I was with my kids on the 58th day at home. And so the neatest thing about that is I got to personally share that with Dr. Murdoch about his book. And what's kind of funny is we had met him at a function, and I actually got to host him and spend some time with him, and I got to tell him that story. And he said, you have to promise me that they'll write that story down and get it to me. And I said, Dr. Murdoch, I'm going to write a book, because I felt like the Lord, I don't know when, but I'm going to write a book. And I said, when I do, you'll get a copy. And of course, he did get a copy, and he had to sign off on some of the quotes and different things and to allow me to use. But what's interestingly enough, I have a close friend sometime many years after that, and he calls me and he says, "Rob, are you at home?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Turn on TBN, the Turner Broadcasting Network." He said, "Turn on TBN." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because there's a guy on there and he's telling your story." And I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I think his name is Murdoch, and he's telling your story on TV." And I laughed and I said, "Yeah, it's the story of the covenant of the 58 blessings." And so I shared with him that, and of course all that's in the book.
Man, that's great, Rob. Man, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're home, and obviously this had to have a massive impact on your family's faith and you as a unit. Tell me about that. I love the story about how it influenced Mike, but where did it go from there with your family?
Well, yeah, I think at that point, all of my kids, my wife was really good about it, but she got all of my kids committed to full participation in my recovery. And every kid had an assignment.
Yeah.
Chelsea's assignment was to babysit the two younger kids, because we had 5 years between our second and our third. So they were 14, 11, but now we had 7 and 4. And so the two younger ones needed to be cared for at times when mom wasn't going to be there. So Chelsea was as good as her mother. I mean, Chelsea was, if you know Chelsea, she's pretty hardcore. But anyway, she was really good at taking care of them. That was her job. Nathan's job was to take care of all the yard work, and maintain stuff. Interestingly enough, we lived 3 doors down from a pastor of a local church, and when he saw the food coming to the door and everything, we didn't really know him, just passing by. But he showed up the door. He said, "Okay, what happened? I recognize all this. What's going on?" And so they shared it with him. Well, he would come and help Nathan do yard work and take care of things, and so he was there helping as well. My 7-year-old, if you know Elena, she's highly, highly detailed. She actually has a chemistry degree, so that gives you a little idea from college. But she was responsible for building charts for my exercises and my vitamins and everything that I had to do in the day. She had on a whiteboard chart, and then she would make sure I did it, and then she would mark it off. And if you ever thought about, I mean, here I am. I mean, I'm somewhat crippled at this point. I'm very limited what I can do. And there was no arguing with the 7-year-old child. I either did it or trouble. It was going to be trouble. And so, and she loved checking off the board, so I had no choice. Whatever she told me I had to do, that's what I did. And of course, then the 4-year-old, he was the entertainment committee. So whenever anybody came to visit, he was part of the entertainment. And he was a cowboy at the time. That was his mantra. And so there's stories of friends that showed up, and David, while they're sitting on the couch talking to me, David would tie them up, because they were the robbers and he was the good guy. And so, and there's nothing I could do about it, and so, but I remember one of our friends came in and he said that let me know I was part of the family. And so he shared that wasn't a bad thing getting tied up. It was just knowing that I was part of the family. And so the family was full participation. I had because they had to graft me. Wherever you graft with skin, it doesn't know where to grow. You put the graft on, it just grows. So on all of my back, underneath my arm, I had grafts. And so those grafts were growing together. So I had to move my shoulder up to keep that skin from just growing over. So I'd be like duck foot on my shoulder. So they gave me a pulley system that attached to the top of a door, and I would have to sit and take this arm from a pulley and pull this arm up as high as I could get it. And of course the kids made me do that. And I would take my shirt off, because every time I did, I'd blood would run down my side. And, my kids were right in the middle of that, making me do the pull-ups so they were completely immersed and part of the recovery. And they lived it right with us. And when we prayed together, and and the kids, I mean, obviously they had their times, with it, but for the most part, they felt like they were as much recovering as I was,
Yeah.
and they were immersed in it. So that's how we kind of handled it as a family.
So at this point, how long did it take you to get from what you just described to where, for lack of a better way to say it, you're back to a normal routine? I mean, how long was that?
You know, interestingly enough, we tried to get back to as much normal as quickly as we could, and I was, you know, my always my thought process was I was tired of the attention on me. I was, and people would say to me, they'd say things like, "Man, we're so sorry this happened." And my first thought in my head was, "Don't be sorry for me. I'm fine. God's got me where He wants me, and I'm on His road, and that's fine. We don't have a problem with that." And so, and I'd always tell, and so I came to a place where I came to the understanding that my problems, they're just mine. They're not worse than yours. They're not better than yours. They're just mine. And your problems are yours. And my problems don't outweigh yours, and yours don't outweigh mine. They're just ours. And so that kind of was I tried to adopt that philosophy. But obviously I needed help, and there's just a lot of things I couldn't do. And so, through the process. So how long did it take? I'm going to say years really, but from the time of the accident, there was actually a plastic surgeon that was involved in the business that we were involved with. So not directly with us, but indirectly. And he was a maxillofacial surgeon, board certified maxillofacial surgeon, and a board certified plastic hand surgeon, which I needed that. That's what I needed, plastic surgery. And so we ended up, make a long story short, we ended up deciding we were going to work with him. Well, he lived in Chico, California, which is a long way from Gilbert, Arizona. But we went to him and decided we're going to have him do the recovery. But he wouldn't even start plastic surgery, recovery surgery for a year. So we didn't even start until the following December. And that's when we started the surgeries. And I had 7 major surgeries in the burn center, and I've had over 30 total. So and interestingly enough, the insurance company that I had, we bought the best insurance that money could buy, paid the high premiums, the whole deal. And I put this out of my mind. I can't even tell you the name of the company anymore. But anyway, we bought that insurance, and about 8 months into my accident, the insurance company wrote us a letter and said, "We're leaving the state, so you're not going to have insurance." And I'm thinking, wow, how you can just leave me, right? You can just walk up and leave me. So their program was that they were required to give me a year and a half, because I was considered disabled at that time. They were required to pay for my recovery, if you will, for 18 months. Well, in talking to my surgeon, starting a year after the crash, he said, "Rob, we have 3 to 5 years of recovery, of surgical recovery." Well, when he found out that we had 18 months of surgery, and he told me this later, he said, "Because I knew your faith and I knew your fortitude, I knew who you were," he said, he told me, "We're going to do 3 years of recovery in 18 months. And we started the surgeries. And at that time, so he was in Chico, so we'd have to fly to Sacramento, rent a car, drive to Chico, which is about an hour and 20 minutes up there, do the surgery, and then we get in the car, drive back, fly home. And we did that every 30 days for 15 months. And when I went up there, of course, the first surgeries were pretty major. The first surgery he put me in the hospital, and he literally pulled all this side of my skin off my skull and remanipulated it. He put in bladders up in the top of my head where the skin was still good, that he put saline in, and he stretched that skin so that at a later date he could pull it all off again and pull that skin down. Because I was burned, probably about to center point, and all this hair, everything was gone. I mean, it was this whole side of my head was basically scar tissue and, and wounds. And so he would blow these things up with a needle and put in saline, and the doctors here in Arizona would do it, would follow up, and they'd blow it up and stretch it. And then I'd go back and we do surgery and pull the skin over. And he actually got it almost all the way back over on the top here. He did that in my neck to try to bring skin up. And we did that in several different places. And of course, every time I went, he would do something with my hand and then something on my face. And so I'd go back and then he'd do something on the other hand and something on my face. And so we did that for 15 months, every 30 days. And it was quite a deal. And you know what people don't know is Richard and Marilyn, that's their names, the doctors. She was a nurse. She was an RN. That's how they got together. But they fixed their guest room at their house into a hospital room. And because she's an RN, they left, when I left the hospital or I left the surgery center, his surgery center, they would leave my IV ports in. And I would go immediately back to their house, into the room, their guest room, and then she would administer any medications to me. And we would recover there, and then got to a point where we could come home. And we became very, very close friends. And they taught me so much about generosity and about how you care and love for people. It was amazing. It was just amazing. And I laugh because, my wife and I, we did okay financially, but we weren't wealthy by any stretch. And we were flying. He was a plastic surgeon. They did very well. They had a beautiful home. But anyway, we were flying back out there. And I told my wife, I said, because he didn't charge me anything for this. He just took what the insurance gave him. And it was crazy. And so we were driving up there. I said, we need to buy Richard his favorite bottle of wine, or maybe even a case. She said, oh, no, Rob, we're not going to do that. I said, why? He said, because do you know what his favorite wine is? I think it was $1,200 a bottle for his wine, his favorite wine. And a case of them would have been financially. So, but he wouldn't let us do anything financially. They took care of us, and they taught us generosity. They taught us stuff that you just don't ever get in any other situation like that. So what was
I have to ask, was it hard for you to get back in a plane?
The commercial flights, no, but there is a story about that, because the first time we were going to fly up to consult with Richard, we booked the flights, Southwest, I flew a lot. It was so commercial. I didn't have a thought about it. It wasn't, to me, I knew we made a mistake. And anyway, so we get everything all ready to go. And Stephanie and I get in the car to drive to the airport. And we literally get halfway to the airport, and she looks at me, and her face, she's as white as a ghost. And I'm like, what's wrong? She said, I can't get on that airplane. And I'm like, okay, what do you mean? Now remember, I haven't had any surgeries. My ear's gone. This side of my face is burned. I'm in bandages. I'm wrapped. My hands are in pressure garments, to keep the fluid from pooling and I'm a mess, right? And I can walk, but I'm not real good at it. And so she's like, what are you going to do? And at that point I decided, you know what? Somewhere I've got to step back into leadership of the family. And I said, I'm going to California to see my doctor. And she said, okay. So rather than us parking the car and going and flying, she dropped me off. And I got my stuff, my roller bag, and I started heading for the airplane. And I went to California by myself. Now, that night when I got there, we called to talk, and she said, hey, I talked to a close friend of ours who's an anesthesiologist, and he's going to get me some muscle relaxers, and I'm going to get on the flight tomorrow. Wow. And so she did, and she caught up to me, and we stayed with family in Sacramento, and then we drove up to Chico the next day. But she came in, and interestingly enough, our family there in Sacramento, I laid carpet as a kid. Now remember, I'm burned, I'm bandaged, I'm a mess, right? I'm only 10 months off of this, right? And their carpet needed fixed. So I said, go down and rent this, this, and this. And I actually got down on my hands and knees and tightened up the carpet for them. So when you say, how fast did you get back to life? I was trying in every way I could to get back to just being normal again. And,
Yeah.
but that started the whole process of our recovery. So,
well, if you have a couple more minutes, tell, have you talked to other burn victims and the experience that they've had? Because it sounds like, I mean, not sounds like, it is, your family came together as a unit, and your marriage. I look at how blessed and favored you have been, and it's awesome to serve the Father that you serve. I mean, it's
yeah,
fantastic, but that's not
yeah,
true for everybody.
no,
So
it's
have you
not.
talked to anyone else and their story was different?
There was, during my therapies here, they had me in physical therapy and occupational therapy. And I met a young man who had climbed into a fuel tank, a large fuel tank, to clean it. And he was in there with a brush and was brushing it, and something metal clanked and sparked, and the fumes in there. So he was caught in a flash fire inside the tank, and it burned his shoulder. He was burned maybe 10%. He didn't, but his shoulder and the side of his face a little bit, but mostly it was his shoulder and his arm that was burned. And I kind of befriended him, and we talked, and I was trying to work with him and help him, and because he really, I could tell he was down in the dumps about it, very depressed. And I even went to his house a few times during my recovery to try to talk to him and his family and work with them. And I reached a point where I knew I couldn't help him, and so I let it go. But I worked really hard for a couple months, meeting with him pretty regularly to try to help him emotionally and mentally recover. And people talk about PTSD. I still have PTSD even to this day, but about some of the stuff. Most of it, today I laugh at, but it was, there were some rough spots, and how do you work through it? I remember when I was in the burn center and I was going to go home, they had a psychologist in there that would help with this type of stuff. And I met him and I knew him, and he would come in and talk to us as a family and talk to me. And I knew enough to know that he said he believed in Jesus, but he wasn't saved. He wasn't, Jesus wasn't his leader and savior. And so he came into the hospital about the time we were going to go home, and my wife was in there. And just to give you an idea that where her head was at, where we were at, he said, you're going to go home, you're going to suffer some things. You're going to suffer depression. You're going to go through these things. And she said, whoa, wait a minute. And he said, what? And she said, you can leave now. And she kicked him out of my room. And she basically said, we're not programming your mind. You're going to do great. That was the mindset. And it was the mindset we carried through everything that we did with this. Yep. And so to me, that was really important. So now a second time, because I had to go back to Burn Center, he came to see me again, and he started to talk to me. And he said, hey, before we talk, I said, I have nothing but respect for you, and I really appreciate what you do here. But I said, I'm more than willing, because then I asked him, I said, do you believe in Jesus? He said, well, I think Jesus existed, but do I believe he's a savior of the world? I don't think so. And, he was just, and I said, well, I'll tell you what, I said, before we talk anymore, I said, I'd get it for you, but I'm a little caught up right now. I said, find the book More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell. I said, you read that book and then come and I want to talk to you. And of course, that was the last time I ever saw him. But that was just where we were. And we just decided that, hey, this is our road and we're on it, and we're going to do everything we can to honor God, and we know he'll do everything to honor us. And so that was our mindset. That's the way we kind of took everything.
Amen, Rob. Hey, I know this is your book, and I am so proud not only to have a copy, but to know the
Yeah.
author and to hear the story. And we're going to have your information. We're going to have link to your book, everything in the description of this podcast. And I just
Cool.
want to thank you. I want to thank you for your time. I didn't expect to get emotional. I mean, I'm just being honest with you. I've
Yeah.
heard your story a couple times, and to sit here, it's like, wow, the power of God is incredible, and it's just awesome to see and hear it again. So thank you, Rob.
Absolutely. And I try not to get emotional through it too either to communicate it, but a lot of times when you get into the real details of the story, you relive it to some degree, and you relive it from a positive side because now I see the results of where it led us. And in the book, I tried to include 12 chapters in there on what does it take to have courage. And I think a lot of people, they get confused about the definition of what courage is. And courage, you want to say, well, courage is just being able to go through anything. And no, courage is being able to find the right resources to help you go through everything. And it's just like taking vitamins, that's going to help you in your health. Eating right, that's going to help you in your health. I put in 12 lessons of courage and in the book. And I think those were critical factors in our recovery. And I think it's important. So yeah, hopefully anybody that might hear this will get the book and read it and share it.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to thank you, and thank you for just not only all you've done in my own personal life, but thank you for sharing today, because my mission is to get this message out to as many people as I can, because they need to hear your story, and it's a story of encouragement, and it's awesome. So thank you.
Hey, thank you.